Stop. I'll buy those 3 fat widows. Without them, I'd be dead. The words cracked through the market square like a bullwhip, silencing the gossip and the laughter in a single heartbeat. Every eye turned to the mountain man, Jedediah Boone, leaning heavy on a rough-hewn cane, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury. Before him, 3 women stood frozen, their shoulders slumped under the weight of 1,000 whispered insults. But what the crowd didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was the debt this man owed them. A debt paid not in coin, but in blood, sweat, and sheer unbreakable will. To understand why he'd say something so shocking, so utterly insane, we have to go back. Back to the moment the mountain decided it wanted him dead. The wind howled a lonely song through the Colorado highlands, a sound Jedediah knew better than any human voice. For 15 years since he'd buried his wife Sarah and their little girl Mary, the mountain had been his only companion. Its silence was his peace, its dangers his daily bread. His hands, rough as the bark on the pines he trapped between, moved with the easy grace of a man who knew his work. The trap line was almost set for the night. The sun hung low, painting the snow-dusted peaks in shades of blood and iron. "Ought to finish 'fore dark," he muttered, the words swallowed by the wind. A habit born from years of speaking only to himself. He tested a snare wire, its cold steel a familiar comfort. It had to be strong. Winter in these parts didn't forgive weakness. The first tremor was so faint he almost dismissed it, a slight shiver in the frozen earth beneath his boots, like a sleeping giant stirring in its slumber. But then it came again, stronger this time. The ground bucked, a low growl rolling down from the peaks above, a sound that wasn't thunder. It was deeper, hungrier. Jedediah's head snapped up, his heart hammered against his ribs. The entire mountainside was moving, a living, breathing wave of rock and mud and ancient trees, breaking free from its moorings. "Dear Lord in heaven," he breathed, the prayer ripped from his lungs. The avalanche didn't just fall, it lunged. It devoured everything in its path with a deafening roar that shook the very firmament. Instinct, honed by 1,000 lonely nights and 100 close calls, screamed at him. Run. He spun on his heel, but the earth was a bucking bronco, throwing him off balance. Behind him, the sound of snapping timber was like gunfire. A sharp crack, louder than the rest, split the air right above him. He glanced up. A massive pine, its roots torn from the earth, was toppling, a wooden giant falling directly toward him. He threw himself forward, a desperate, clumsy lunge. But it wasn't fast enough. The trunk slammed into him with the force of a freight train, driving the air from his body in a single, crushing blow. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded through his chest, his legs. The weight was unbearable, pinning him to the ground, a bug under a boot. Through a haze of tears and dust, he watched the avalanche swallow his cabin whole. The log walls he'd raised with his own hands splintered like kindling. 15 years of his life erased in 15 seconds. The world dissolved into a chaos of noise and darkness. This is how it ends, he thought, the irony a bitter pill. A man who outlived his family, who survived bears and blizzards, was about to be killed by the one thing he trusted, his mountain. Each breath was a new battle, a knife twisting in his lungs. Dark spots danced in his vision. "Lord," he whispered through cracked lips, tasting blood. "I reckon I'm ready." He thought of Sarah, of little Mary. Maybe it was time. But then, through the roar and the ringing in his ears, he heard something impossible. Voices. At first he thought it was the fever in his brain, or maybe angels come to carry him home. But these voices were earthly, they were panicked, and they were getting closer. "Over here, I see him!" The voice was a woman's, thick with a grit he hadn't heard in years. "Good Lord, he's trapped under that tree." Another voice, deeper, called out, "Martha, Rebecca, grab hold here. We'll need all 3 of us to shift it." Through the settling dust, 3 figures emerged, scrambling over the treacherous, shifting ground. They were substantial women, their skirts hiked up, their faces streaked with dirt and fierce with determination. He recognized them, vaguely. The Watson sisters, widows from the edge of town. The ones the gossips called the Fat Sisters when they thought no one was listening. Jedediah had no time for such meanness, but he never imagined his life would depend on the very thing the town mocked. They reached him, their chests heaving, their hands already raw from the climb. Without a word of hesitation, they threw themselves at the debris around him, clearing branches and rocks with a desperate fury. Their hands, which looked soft from town life, were quickly torn and bleeding, but they didn't slow. They didn't even seem to notice. "Mr. Boone," the eldest, Martha, spoke, her voice a commander's. "We're going to get this tree off you. When we lift, you push. You hear me? You push with everything you have left." Jedediah tried to nod, a motion that sent fire through his entire body. His voice was a dry rasp. "I'll try." The three women positioned themselves along the massive trunk. Their size, the source of so much ridicule, was now his only hope. They moved with a powerful, coordinated grace, their faces grim with resolve. "Ready now," Martha commanded, her voice cutting through the haze of his pain. "Rebecca, brace your shoulder. Elizabeth, get lower. On my count. 1, 2, 3. With a collective grunt that seemed to shake the broken ground, they heaved. For a terrible second, nothing happened. The pine didn't budge. Jedediah's heart sank. It was too heavy. It was impossible. But then, slowly, miraculously, the crushing weight on his chest began to lift. Just an inch. He roared, a sound of pure agony and effort, and pushed up with his arms. "Keep going!" Martha screamed, her teeth clenched, her face purple with strain. "Almost there." With one final monumental shove, the trunk shifted. It moved just enough for Jedediah to writhe and drag himself free. The four of them collapsed, gasping in the thin, cold air, their bodies trembling. The sisters' dresses were in tatters, their hands a bloody mess, but their eyes shone with a triumphant fire. "Thank the Lord," Elizabeth breathed, her voice shaking. She helped Jedediah sit up, her touch surprisingly gentle. "We were walking the high meadow. We saw the slide start." Jedediah's chest was a symphony of pain. His legs felt like they'd been shattered with a sledgehammer. But he was alive. He was alive because three women the world had dismissed as useless had refused to let him die. The wind picked up, its icy fingers slicing through their sweat-soaked clothes. Night was falling, and the temperature was plummeting. Jedediah looked at the ruin of his home, at the grave of his solitary life, and a profound emptiness washed over him. He had nothing left. "You can't stay here," Rebecca said, her voice firm, reading the despair on his face. "You'll freeze before morning. Our wagon's down the trail. We'll get you to town." "I can't," he started to protest, the old pride clawing its way up. Martha silenced him with a look that could curdle milk. "Mr. Boone, we did not just risk our necks pulling you out from under that tree to watch you die of stubbornness. You can either walk to that wagon with what little dignity you have left, or we will carry you. And I promise you, you will not enjoy the ride." Despite the pain, despite the loss, a laugh, rusty and raw, bubbled up from Jedediah's chest. It hurt, but it was real. These three women, these angels in mud-stained dresses, had more grit than any man he'd ever known. "Yes, ma'am," he managed, accepting their help to his feet. "I reckon I know better than to argue." Supported between them, they began the slow, agonizing journey down the mountain. Behind them, his old life disappeared into the gloom. But ahead in the gathering darkness, a new bond was taking root, forged in chaos, a connection that would soon be tested by a darkness far more malicious than any landslide. They thought they had survived the worst the mountain could throw at them. They were wrong. The mountain was just the beginning. The path down was a treacherous ribbon of loose shale and tangled roots, made worse by the gathering dark. Martha Gaines took Jedediah's right arm, her sturdy frame a solid anchor. On his left, Eliza Porter matched her step for step, her grip surprisingly strong. Ruth Taylor followed close behind, carrying a lantern that cast their long, dancing shadows against the trees. Every step was a fresh agony for Jedediah. His ribs felt like a bundle of broken glass, and his legs threatened to give out. "Just leave me," he muttered, his voice hoarse with pain and pride. "You've done enough." Hush now, Martha said, her tone leaving no room for argument. We're not about to let you expire on this trail after all the trouble we went to. Eliza, ever the one to find a sliver of light in the darkness, managed a small, breathy laugh. Besides, Mr. Boone, we've already ruined our best dresses hauling you out. We might as well see this through to the end. The moon rose, a cold silver disk in the black sky, illuminating the toll the rescue had taken. Their skirts were ripped and caked in mud. Their hands were a raw mess of cuts and splinters, but their faces, caught in the lantern light, were set with a stubborn resolve that was more beautiful than any ballroom gown. They had to stop every few minutes, propping Jedediah against a boulder while he fought for breath. During one of these breaks, Ruth pressed a water skin to his lips. "Drink," she urged, her voice soft. His face was a pale mask in the moonlight, and the dark stains on his makeshift bandages were spreading. He was feverish, his skin hot to the touch despite the biting cold. They had to get him to shelter. Fast. After what felt like an eternity, a small cottage came into view, a single point of warm light in the vast, unforgiving darkness. It wasn't much, just a two-room rental on the far edge of town, but tonight it looked like a palace. "Almost there," Martha grunted as they helped him through the narrow doorway. The main room was small and spare, but clean. A pot-bellied stove radiated a welcome warmth. Ruth had hurried ahead to stoke the embers. Together they eased Jedediah onto a straw mattress she'd dragged close to the fire. He groaned, his face twisting as the pain surged. "Ruth, hot water and clean cloths," Martha directed, taking charge as she always did. "Eliza, see what herbs we have for pain." The women moved with the quiet efficiency of a well-drilled army. Ruth set a large pot on the stove. Eliza rummaged through a small wooden box, her fingers sorting through dried leaves and roots. "I've got yarrow for the bleeding," Eliza announced, "and willow bark for the pain. Some feverfew, too. Praise be." Martha nodded as she carefully cut away the remnants of Jedediah's torn shirt. The lamplight revealed a canvas of angry purple bruises spreading across his chest and back. "This will hurt some," she warned him, but Jedediah had already slipped into a hazy fever dream state, muttering names they didn't know. "Sarah, Mary." They worked in silent harmony. Ruth gently washed the grime and blood from his wounds, her touch surprisingly deft. Martha examined his ribs, her face grim. "3, maybe 4 cracked," she announced quietly. "We'll need to bind them tight." Eliza brewed a bitter-smelling tea on the stove, the scent of herbs filling the small space. They tore strips from one of their few spare sheets to bind his chest, the clean white linen a stark contrast to his bruised skin. Throughout the night, they took turns sitting by his side. When his fever spiked near midnight, they spooned the willow bark tea between his lips and wiped his face with cool, damp cloths. When the chills came, they piled their own shawls and quilts on top of him, sacrificing their own warmth. Ruth sat the first watch, her clear voice a soft comfort as she sang old hymns. Eliza took the middle hours, keeping the fire fed and telling quiet stories of her childhood to fill the long, dark silence. Martha took the pre-dawn shift, her practical eyes watching for any change, any sign that he was slipping away from them. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the window, Martha felt his forehead. It was still hot, but the raging fire had banked. His breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, seemed a little easier. "How is he?" Eliza asked, stirring from where she'd been dozing in a chair. "Better, I think," Martha replied softly. "The fever's down some." Ruth joined them, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes bright with a fragile hope. They looked at the man sleeping on their floor, a stranger who had crashed into their lives, and a silent question hung in the air between them. "What happens now?" Ruth asked, voicing the thought. "His cabin is gone. Everything he owned is buried under that slide." Martha squared her shoulders. "For now he stays here. He heals." "The town gossips will have a field day," Eliza remarked, a ghost of her usual humor returning. "3 widows taking in a lone mountain man. My, my." "Let them talk," Martha said, her voice like flint. "The good Lord put him in our path for a reason, and we'll see it through." Just then, Jedediah's eyes fluttered open. For the first time, his gaze was clear, focused. He looked from one weary face to the next. "You stayed," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. A universe of disbelief was in those two words. "Of course we stayed," Ruth answered gently. "Now rest. You're safe." And in that moment, in the quiet dawn of a new day, they all felt it. This wasn't just a rescue. It was something more. It was a reckoning. But as the sun rose higher, a new shadow was falling over their small town. A shadow of greed and power that would soon threaten to swallow them all whole. They had saved him from the mountain, but they were about to find out there are far worse monsters than rock and mud. For 2 days, the cottage was a sanctuary of healing. The aroma of herbal teas and simmering broth replaced the scent of blood and dirt. Jedediah, propped against a pile of pillows, watched the three sisters move in a seamless rhythm around their small home. They argued good-naturedly over whose turn it was to knead the bread. They hummed hymns while they mended torn clothes, and they cared for him with a tenderness that pricked at the calloused shell around his heart. He wasn't used to being fussed over. He wasn't used to the sound of quiet laughter. He wasn't used to not being alone. His ribs were a constant, throbbing ache. But something else was healing too. A part of him he thought had died with his wife and child. But their sanctuary was a fragile bubble, and the whispers from the town were starting to seep through the walls. On the third morning, Jedediah insisted he was well enough to walk into town to see the doctor. His pride, stubborn as a mule, couldn't stand being an invalid a moment longer. "Are you certain you're ready for this?" Eliza asked, her brow furrowed with the same worry his Sarah used to have. "A man's got to stand on his own feet," he grumbled, though he was grateful for the sturdy walking stick Martha had found for him. The four of them set out, a strange little procession moving down the dirt road. Jedediah walked slowly, the women flanking him, a silent guard of honor. As they neared the town square, the atmosphere shifted. People stopped to stare. The low buzz of conversation would dip into silence as they passed, only to rise again in a flurry of whispers behind their backs. The market was in full swing, a chaotic swirl of farmers, merchants, and townsfolk, and every eye seemed to find them. "Well, look who's come to town," a voice dripped with scorn. "The three fat hens and their broken-winged rooster." Laughter, sharp and cruel, followed the remark. Jedediah saw Ruth's cheeks flame red. He saw Eliza's smile vanish. He saw Martha's back stiffen as if she'd been struck. And something inside him, something that had been dormant for 15 years, roared to life. A group of women, dressed in their Sunday best, stood near the dry goods store, not even bothering to lower their voices. "What a sight they make," one of them tittered into a lace handkerchief. "Disgraceful." That was it, the final straw, the pain in his ribs, the loss of his home, the uncertainty of his future. It all coalesced into a single point of white-hot rage. He planted his walking stick in the dirt, the thud echoing in the sudden quiet. He turned, his eyes blazing, and his voice, honed by years of calling across windy canyons, boomed across the square. "Stop!" The entire market froze. Conversations died. Horses stopped swishing their tails. All eyes were on him. "I'll buy those three fat widows," he declared, the words hanging in the stunned silence. "Without them, I'd be dead where I lay." He took a step forward, his cane striking the ground like a judge's gavel. "You want to know about these women?" he roared, his voice shaking with a raw power that made people flinch. "While you sat warm by your fires, they climbed a mountain in the dark. While you whispered your petty gossip, they clawed through rock and mud with their bare hands to save a stranger's life." He swept his gaze over the crowd, his eyes locking onto the women who had laughed. "You mock their size? Thank God for every ounce of it. It took all three of them, every bit of their strength, to lift a tree off my chest that would have crushed the life out of any man here." The widows stood behind him, their faces a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and a dawning, fierce pride. No one had ever defended them, not ever. "They took in a broken man." Jedediah's voice grew thick with emotion. "They nursed my wounds, shared their last loaf of bread, and asked for nothing in return. And this is how you repay such Christian charity? With mockery? With scorn. A profound shame began to settle over the square. People looked at the ground, at their shoes, anywhere but at the mountain man and the three women standing behind him like pillars of strength. The town doctor, a good man named Harris, pushed through the crowd. "Perhaps we should see to those ribs now, Mr. Boone," he said gently, trying to diffuse the tension. Jedediah nodded, but he had one last thing to say. He looked at the crowd, at the faces now filled with a grudging respect. "Remember this day," he said, his voice low but caring. "Remember that courage and kindness don't come in the packages you expect. These women are worth more than this whole town put together, and I aim to make sure you never forget it." As they walked toward the doctor's office, the whispers that followed them were different now. They were filled not with scorn, but with awe. But Jedediah's public defiance had done more than just silence the gossips. It had lit a beacon, and it had drawn the attention of a very dangerous man who was watching from the shadows. A man who saw their newfound unity not as a triumph of the human spirit, but as an obstacle to be crushed. That evening, back in the warmth of the cottage, a new plan took root. Jedediah, his ribs properly bound by the doctor, looked at the three women who had become his unlikely saviors. "Once I'm on my feet proper," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I'm going to rebuild, and I want you three to come live with me." The sisters stared at him, stunned into silence. "The land is good," he pressed on. "Plenty of room. We could build it bigger, with proper rooms for all of you. No more paying rent to people who don't appreciate you." It was more than an offer of a home. It was an offer of a family, a future. And in that moment, a fragile hope began to bloom in the little cottage, a hope that would soon be tested by fire and greed. The next morning, a man on a fine bay horse rode up to the cottage. He wasn't a local. His suit was too clean, his boots too polished. He dismounted and strode to the door without waiting for an invitation. "The name's Harrison Wells," he said, his voice smooth as oiled steel. "I'm a surveyor for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad." He didn't offer to shake hands. "I'm here to inform you that this entire parcel of land," he gestured vaguely at the cottage and the small plot around it, "as well as the adjacent mountain slope belonging to a Mr. Boone, falls within the railroad's legally acquired right-of-way." The words dropped into the room like stones in a quiet pond. "What are you talking about?" Martha demanded, stepping in front of Jedediah. "We rent this cottage from Deacon Miller." "An unfortunate arrangement for you," Wells said with a thin, unsympathetic smile. "The deacon's claim, it seems, was invalid. The railroad holds the primary title, granted by the territorial government. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." "And my land?" Jedediah growled, pushing himself forward on his cane. "I've lived on that mountain for 15 years. My father before me." "Do you have a deed, Mr. Boone?" Wells asked, his eyes cold and empty. "A legally filed and recorded deed?" Jedediah faltered. "My father filed the papers. They're at the county clerk's office." "I'm sure they are," Wells said, a hint of mockery in his tone. "But the railroad's grant supersedes all prior unregistered claims. It's the law of progress, Mr. Boone." He tipped his hat, a gesture devoid of any actual politeness. 48 hours. He turned and walked away, leaving them in a state of stunned disbelief. This wasn't a coincidence. The landslide, the town's scorn, and now this. It was an attack, a coordinated effort to break them, to drive them out. They were no longer just fighting for a home. They were fighting a war against an enemy they couldn't even see. The fragile hope of the night before had been replaced by the cold, hard reality of their situation. They were in a fight for their lives, and they were running out of time. The ride into town was a grim, silent affair. Jedediah on his horse, the three widows in their rattling wagon, a small band of outcasts on a desperate mission. The 48-hour deadline hung over them like a guillotine blade. Every passing minute felt like a drop of blood. The county clerk's office was a cramped, dusty room that smelled of old paper and despair. The clerk himself, a man named Peterson with ink-stained fingers and shifty eyes, seemed annoyed by their presence. "Looking for a deed, you say?" He sighed, not bothering to look up from his ledger. "Boone, filed around 1843. "That's a long time ago," Peterson said, finally peering at them over his spectacles. Records that old, they get misplaced. But he shuffled off into a back room, the sound of him moving boxes and muttering to himself doing little to inspire confidence. He returned 20 minutes later, wiping dust from his hands. A small, satisfied smirk played on his lips. Sorry, no record of any Boone land claim. Nothing at all. That's impossible, Jedediah roared, slamming his cane on the floor. I saw the papers myself when my father passed. The records say what they say, Peterson shrugged, already turning back to his work. Now, if you'll excuse me, but Martha stepped forward, her presence filling the small office. Is it possible, Mr. Peterson, she said, her voice dangerously calm, that the railroad's a bit more generous with its coin than the county is with its salaries? Peterson's face went pale. I'll not be accused. No one's accusing you of anything, Martha said, her eyes boring into his. We're just asking if you're absolutely certain you've looked everywhere. The clerk just shook his head, refusing to meet their eyes, and they knew. They knew they had been beaten before they even began. The deed was gone, stolen, erased. As they stumbled out into the harsh sunlight, defeated, a young man hurried out of the office behind them. He was Peterson's assistant, a nervous boy with eyes that darted around like a frightened rabbit. He pressed a folded piece of paper into Martha's hand. I couldn't just let them, he stammered before scurrying back inside. Martha unfolded the paper. It was a hastily scrawled note. The old man kept duplicates, said he hid them in the one place a thief would never look for treasure. Hope, sharp and painful, surged through them. They raced back up the mountain, the wagon wheels churning dust, their hearts pounding with a new frantic urgency. The ruin of Jedediah's cabin was a gaping wound on the mountainside. The deadline was tomorrow at noon. They had less than 24 hours. Where? Eliza asked, looking at the chaos of rock and splintered wood. Where would he hide it? Jedediah's eyes scanned the wreckage, his mind racing back through faded memories of his father. A stern man, a God-fearing man. The one place a thief wouldn't look for treasure, he repeated, his gaze falling on a half-buried shape near what used to be the hearth. The Bible. It was a desperate, back-breaking search. They dug with their bare hands with broken pieces of wood, their muscles screaming in protest. The sun beat down on them. Then clouds began to gather, the sky turning a bruised purple. The first drops of rain began to fall as Ruth's shovel struck something hard. It was a heavy, leather-bound family Bible, scorched and waterlogged, but intact. Jedediah took it with trembling hands, his fingers fumbling with the clasp. He opened it, the damp pages smelling of earth and time. And there, tucked between the pages of Psalms, was a folded, yellowed piece of parchment, protected from the worst of the mud and rain. The land deed, signed, sealed, and dated 1843. Tears of relief streamed down their faces, mingling with the rain. They had it. They had the proof. They had won. But their celebration was cut short by the sound of hoofbeats. Harrison Wells and two of his hired thugs rode out of the trees, their faces dark and menacing in the stormy twilight. I believe that belongs to me, Wells said, his eyes fixed on the deed in Jedediah's hand. Hand it over. This is my land, Jedediah said, standing his ground, the widows forming a protective wall around him. And this is my proof. Wells laughed, a cold, ugly sound. That piece of paper is a complication I don't have time for. He drew a pistol from his coat, the barrel gleaming in the fading light. The deed. Now. Suddenly, a rock flew through the air, striking one of the thugs in the side of the head. He grunted and toppled from his horse. Martha stood with another rock in her hand, her face a mask of pure fury. Chaos erupted. Jedediah swung his cane like a club. Eliza and Ruth armed themselves with heavy branches. It was a desperate, clumsy fight, but they fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. Wells, in rage, spurred his horse forward, trying to trample them, to snatch the deed. But they were a fortress, a four-person shield of pure will. Realizing he couldn't win by force without starting a war he wasn't prepared for, Wells snarled and reined his horse back. Keep your damned paper, he spat, his face contorted with hate. It won't do you any good when you have nowhere to live. He wheeled his horse around and galloped off into the storm, his men close behind. They didn't understand what he meant until they saw the glow in the sky, a horrifying orange glow coming from the direction of their cottage. He hadn't just come for the deed. He had sent other men. While they were fighting him on the mountain, his thugs were carrying out his real plan. They stumbled down the trail, their lungs burning, their hearts filled with a cold dread. The cottage, their small sanctuary, their last refuge, was engulfed in flames. Everything they had, the extra food, the spare clothes, their few precious belongings, was turning to ash. They collapsed at the edge of the clearing, watching the fire consume their last hope, the sound of the crackling flames mingling with the rumble of the storm. They had saved the land, but they had lost everything else. Harrison Wells had played them perfectly. He had drawn them away, and while they fought for a piece of paper, he had destroyed their lives. They were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, a useless deed, and the smoking ruins of their home, alone in the middle of a storm-tossed wilderness. The night had never seemed so dark. The rain fell in cold, hissing sheets, turning the ashes of the cottage into a soupy black sludge. They huddled together under a rocky overhang, a miserable quartet of survivors, the precious deed wrapped in oilcloth and tucked safely inside Jedediah's shirt. The fire had taken everything, their food, their blankets, the herbs Eliza used for healing. They were destitute, exposed, and Jedediah's cough was getting worse, a deep, rattling sound that scared them more than the thunder. The dawn brought no comfort, only a gray, weeping sky and the full, heartbreaking scope of the devastation. The cottage was gone, just a blackened patch on the earth. As they stood staring at the ruins, Eliza suddenly let out a cry. "The barn!" The small barn where they kept their wagon and the two old horses that were their only means of transport stood a few hundred yards away, miraculously untouched by the fire. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was something. They spent the day salvaging what they could, which amounted to a few warped cooking pots and a handful of half-melted tools. The work was grim, their spirits as low as the smoke-stained ground. Jedediah's condition worsened with every hour that passed. The cold and the damp had settled deep in his lungs, and the fever was returning, his skin burning to the touch. That night, huddled in the drafty barn, listening to Jedediah's labored breathing, they hit their lowest point. "What do we do?" Ruth whispered into the darkness, her voice choked with tears. "We have the deed, but we have nothing else. He's sick. We'll starve or freeze out here." "We don't give up," Martha said, her voice a low growl of defiance. But even she sounded weary, the endless fight chipping away at her iron will. And then a new sound cut through the night, the sound of an approaching wagon. Fear, cold and sharp, shot through them. Was it Wells coming back to finish the job? Jedediah struggled to sit up, reaching for a heavy piece of wood to use as a club. Martha stood in the doorway of the barn, a pitchfork gripped in her hands, her body a formidable silhouette against the moonlight. The wagon pulled to a stop. A lone figure climbed down. It wasn't Harrison Wells. It was the doctor from town, Dr. Harris. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice full of a weary sadness. He held up a lantern, and in its light they could see his wagon was loaded with supplies. Blankets, food, medicine. Some of us, we aren't proud of how we've acted. When we heard about the fire, we knew it was the railroad. We knew we couldn't stay silent any longer. It was a trickle, not a flood, but it was a start. The doctor tended to Jedediah, giving him a potent medicine that eased his breathing. He left them with the supplies and a promise. "There's a town meeting being called at the church tomorrow night. Be there. Show them the deed. Show them your faces. Make them choose what kind of town this is going to be." The next day was a blur of preparation. The women used the supplies to make Jedediah as comfortable as possible. They washed their smoke-stained faces in a nearby creek and mended their torn dresses as best they could. When evening came, they hitched the horses to their old wagon, and with Jedediah bundled in blankets in the back, they rode into town. The church was overflowing. It seemed every man, woman, and child had turned out. The air was thick with tension. Harrison Wells and his men were there, sitting in the front pew like lords of the manor, confident and smirking. The widows and Jedediah sat in the back, a small island of defiance. The Reverend Matthews, a man who had until now remained cautiously neutral, stood before the congregation. "We are here tonight," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "to discuss what has become of our community, to look into our hearts and ask if we are people of God or people of greed." Harrison Wells stood up, his voice booming with false sincerity. "Reverend, the railroad brings progress, jobs, prosperity. Are we to let that be halted by the sentimental claims of a few squatters?" But then a voice rose from the crowd. It was Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper, a woman who had once been among the gossips. "You call it progress to burn a man's home? To drive women and a sick man out into the cold?" Another voice joined in, and another. The trickle of support was becoming a stream. People who had been silent out of fear or prejudice were finally finding their courage. Martha stood up, her voice ringing with clarity and power. She held up the blackened, water-stained Bible. "This book holds the history of a family on that mountain, and this deed," she pulled the parchment from its pages, "proves their right. But we are here tonight to talk about a different right, the right to be treated with dignity, the right to be safe in our homes, the right to stand up to bullies who think their money makes them kings." She looked directly at Harrison Wells. "You tried to break us. You tried to burn us out. But you failed, because you don't understand that our strength doesn't come from a piece of paper or a log cabin. It comes from here." She pressed her hand to her heart. "It comes from standing by each other when the world turns against us." A profound silence filled the church. The town was holding its breath. And in that moment, the shifty-eyed county clerk, Peterson, stood up, his face slick with sweat. He couldn't take the pressure. "He made me do it," he cried, pointing a trembling finger at Wells. "He paid me to lose the deed. I have the records to prove it." The church erupted. The dam of fear had broken, and a flood of righteous anger swept through the room. Men surged forward, their faces thunderous. Harrison Wells and his men, seeing the tide turn against them so violently, scrambled for the exits, the crowd parting with jeers and curses. They had lost, not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. They had been judged by the very people they sought to control, and they had been found wanting. The fight wasn't over, but the war for the soul of the town had been won. The widows and the mountain man, bruised and battered but unbroken, stood together in the warm light of the church, surrounded not by enemies, but by neighbors. The next morning the sun rose on a different world. A wagon train of townspeople, led by the blacksmith and the reverend, made its way up the mountain trail. They came with hammers and saw, with baskets of food and bolts of cloth. They came to rebuild what had been destroyed. The sound of hammers striking nails became the new hymn of the mountainside. A new, larger cabin began to rise from the ashes, built not by one man's solitary hands, but by the strength of a community that had rediscovered its conscience. Jedediah, still weak but with a fire in his eyes, directed the work, his voice sure and steady. The widows were the heart of the operation, organizing supplies, tending to the workers, their laughter echoing through the pines. They were no longer the fat sisters, the outcasts. They were Martha, Eliza, and Ruth, the cornerstones of this new beginning. Weeks later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the peaks, the new cabin stood finished, warm and solid, a testament to what they had endured and overcome. That night they gathered around a long table made from a single, massive pine. The table was laden with a feast prepared by the women of the town as a housewarming gift. Jedediah looked at the faces around him, the three women who had pulled him from his grave, not once, but 3 times. They were more than his rescuers. They were his family. He raised a cup of cider. "To the women who taught a stubborn old mountain man that a home isn't made of logs and nails," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "It's made of courage and loyalty and love." The cabin filled with cheers. Outside, the winter wind howled, but inside, there was only warmth. The railroad had moved on, forced to reroute their tracks around the Boone property, their defeat a lasting legend in the valley. Harrison Wells and the clerk faced justice, their greed exposed for all to see. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom or on a map. It was here, in this room. It was in the transformation of a lonely man into a father and a husband in all but name. It was in the transformation of three scorned widows into the respected matriarchs of the mountain. They had faced the fury of the earth and the malice of men, and they had not only survived, they had triumphed. They had taken the ugliest parts of their world, the scorn, the greed, the violence, and built something beautiful in its place, a home, a family, a future. This story is a powerful reminder that the greatest strength often comes from the most unexpected places. And true justice is not just about winning a fight, but about building something better in its wake. It reminds us that our own communities are only as strong as the courage we show when standing up for our neighbors. If you were moved by their story of resilience and what it means to truly build a community, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know when the next story might be the one you need to hear. Thanks for listening.